Welcome, everyone. We are live with another episode of Level Up Law, where every Tuesday at noon here at South Carolina Legal Services, we are leveling up your legal knowledge about an area of law that we practice in. And often we do that sharing information with our partners in other nonprofit organizations and in other ways besides just us lawyers talking. But today I'll be talking about installment land contracts. So stay tuned for just a moment as we bring you that information on today's episode. I do want to thank Kenneth Elliott, who's with us again today as our producer in the background. Thanks for being here, Kenneth. And also, as always, we do want to remind you that today's presentation is not legal advice to you. If you have some need for the help of a lawyer on this or any other topic, you can apply for our services, and that will be provided for you at the end of today's episode on the last slide or two. So you can stay tuned for that if you think that you need a lawyer. And when it comes to installment land contracts, definitely having a lawyer is in order because it can get kind of complicated. Today we're just going to talk about the basics. But this is just general information for the public, but it is important information. So stay tuned as we talk about that. Also, as a couple of reminders, the registration link for upcoming episodes of Level Up Law is always on our calendar on our website at www.sclegal.org. So you can check there every week, or you can follow us on social media, sign up for our email. There's lots of other ways to find out what is coming up on future episodes of the show. Also, all of our episodes are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel by producer Kenneth Elliott, usually pretty quickly. So keep in mind that this will be available for you to rewatch if you are here live there on our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead. As we get started, I do want to remind everybody of the QR code that is here on your screen. And we'll share that again at the end of today's presentation so you can sign up for our newsletter. Get started. Installment land contracts. What are they? How do they work? We'll try to just give you some basics today and some tips that you need to know if you are getting ready to sign up for one of these. So here's just a little definition of installment land contract. This is usually an agreement where you as the buyer promise to make a monthly payment. Sometimes you have a down payment, and then you're going to pay these monthly payments for however many months or years. And at the end of that time, if you've made all the payments, then the seller will give you a deed to the property that you're buying, okay? And that's kind of how these work. But keep in mind, these are used a lot and called many different things. So I've just given you some of the titles that we see when we have clients come in with this type of an arrangement about buying a home. They call it a bond for title, sometimes articles of agreement for deed, contract for deed, rent to own or lease to own, and even the lease with an option to buy can be an installment land contract. And also, you may often hear these referred to as the poor man's mortgage, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's not a mortgage, it is just a contract to buy property. So I want to start out with the pros and cons of an installment land contract. And I'll call it that throughout the presentation, even though it's referred to by many other names. So you might be entering into one of these. It seems simple, it seems straightforward, but you want to be aware of the pitfalls. So first, let's give the one pro that I can think of in entering into this kind of a contract is that if you have no other path to home ownership, you can't qualify for a mortgage for some reason, maybe your credit report isn't quite up to snuff, or maybe your debt to income ratio, which is something they always talk about in mortgage applications. Maybe that's not where it should be. There's any number of ways that you can be in a position where you can't borrow money to buy a home in the regular way with a deed of mortgage. And that's how you normally would want to do it, because with the mortgage, you're getting a loan, and that loan is actually paying at that time for the house that you're buying, and then you actually get a deed to the property. When it comes to a land installment land contract, that's not the case. You don't get the property until you've paid all the money in that monthly way. So there's mostly cons about these. I did want to give you that one pro. Let's talk about the cons, okay? This is high risk, and one of the reasons is that it is subject to a lot of abuse and predatory practices, and you'll see that as we go through, because really the seller of the property is really in charge, and often there is not a lot you can do. This is not going to carry with it the usual consumer rights and protections that we have in state and federal law if we're buying a house with that traditional mortgage. There's a lot of law that protects you in that scenario, but not when it comes to an installment land contract. There is some basic, what we call common law, that's in reported cases in our state, but that's about the best that you can do. So another con, if you fail to make a payment, or if you're in some other kind of default, like maybe you're supposed to pay, keep the property insured, but your insurance lapses, or maybe you change insurance companies and you fail to notify the seller that you're just changing companies, you're not losing your coverage. And then they may say, okay, you're in default, I'm taking the property back. So you're like, wait a minute, how can you do that? Well, unfortunately, without there being a mortgage, which carries some traditional ways of and requirements, really legal requirements of how you get that property back, quite often the seller in these kind of contracts is just going to say, you know, I'm going to evict you from the house because you haven't paid, and it starts to feel like it's a lease, right? Like you're renting instead of buying. And so we'll talk about how that eviction process doesn't really apply here in just a little bit. Whereas with mortgages, obviously, you're going to have a whole foreclosure legal process, and any sale or taking the property away from you is going to be through that judicial process under our law. Now, just a warning, a lot of people who enter into these kind of contracts never really make it to the end, never become the full owner of that property. And when that happens, quite often you lose all those payments that you made when you thought the payments were going towards the actual purchase of the property. So important to keep in mind that these are usually for the long haul, and you've got to make sure that you do it right, make it to the end, and that all the parties understand what the deal is and what's going on. So before you sign one of these, you want to make sure that you fully understand exactly what your obligations are and the seller's obligations are, and obviously that you can afford it. Because if you miss a payment on one of these, it's a lot different than in the mortgage world, where now there's intervention, there's modification sometimes, there's helpful programs. When people get behind, you don't have that with this kind of a contract. So usually you're going to be responsible for all the costs in addition to that payment, but you got to look at that contract that is being offered to you, that document that says how things are going to be, and make sure what those responsibilities are going to be put on you. All right, two of the most important things that you can possibly know about a installment land contract, and that is, number one, as I just said, look at that contract and review it before you sign it. Make sure you know what the deal is. Sometimes these legal documents can make your eyes glaze over, but you got to read it, because every paragraph in there is important for you to know going forward before you sign it. Because what the buyer and seller intend from that document, what both parties are expecting, is what a court is going to look at if you get to that point where there's some sort of a dispute. Okay, so that intention of the parties is the key in all of these. And as I said, there's a lot of different names for this. And it's not so important what the title of it is, but what it actually says. You want to know, what are you going to pay and when are you going to pay it? So do you have to make a down payment? Are there some other incremental payments besides a monthly payment that you're going to have to make? And then when will you finish paying? And how will all of that be determined as to how much of those payments goes towards the final purchase price? Because sometimes those payments are not going towards the purchase price or not fully going towards the purchase price. And the way you're going to know that is what that document says. And then the other important thing that you're going to want to look for in there, when will you get the deed? Is it going to be after 10 years? Is it going to be after 5 years? Is it going to be 20 years? You want to know, when is that going to happen? Because you want to make sure that that seller is going to be available to sign over that deed to you. You don't want to have to be dealing with some other entity or maybe an estate or a family member or someone else. You want to make sure that person who's going to be signing that deed is going to be around. The number 2 most important thing is when you sign one of these, it needs to be recorded. Okay. In the Register of Deeds in your county, wherever the property is, that's where a installment land contract needs to be recorded. And the reason for that is because things can be done with property. It could be deeded out to someone other than you. If you have a seller who's not doing right by you, they might say, well, I'm going to go ahead and sell this property. And then suddenly you have no recourse and you've been paying all this money, right? But if your agreement or your contract is recorded at the Register of Deeds office, that's where people go to make sure that the person they're buying property from actually owns the property. And so when they do that search, they will see your installment land contract and they'll realize that there's someone else who has an interest in that property that they're going to have to deal with if they want to buy the property. So, that's one thing that can happen. Also, if the person you're buying it from, the seller, decides they need some money, they want to get a mortgage on the property. Well, when you do that, again, the Register of Deeds office has to be reviewed. The records about this particular piece of property has to be reviewed so that the mortgage company knows that there's not anyone else with any interest in the property other than the seller. And when they go to look that up, they'll see that you have an interest in the property. And we'll talk about what kind of interest that is here in just a minute. Now, and as it says here on the slide, just so you'll know, you have to have the original to register a document like that at the Register of Deeds. They don't register copies. It needs to be an original. And so if the seller is hesitant about giving you the original, you can always do what's called duplicate originals. That means you have 2 copies of the exact same document and both parties sign both of those originals, and then they can't be changed. Okay. Here's some features in installment land contract that can show what the intent of the parties is. And as I said earlier, this is what a court always looks to. Whatever the title of the document is, can be really not all that relevant. And what's important is the content of the document. So it might say it's a bond for title, but it really isn't. It might say it's a lease with an option to buy, but when you look at the wording of it, that's not really what it is. So some of the things that a court might look for in a document to determine, is this an installment land contract where you, you are supposed to own the property at the end of the contract when all the payments are made. So here's some of those things that a court might look for. The seller keeps the title until all the payments are made, and then they sign over the deed. And that's what this contract says is supposed to happen. Then you have the buyer has the right to possession in other words, to live there on the property as their home until they get a deed to the property after all those payments are made. Now, sometimes they'll have a forfeiture clause. And basically what I mean by that is if the buyer, you, miss a payment, then the seller can just take the home back, and any of the payments you have made are forfeited as rent, meaning the seller gets to keep those payments. So that's important to realize that if it says that, you may have a problem if the seller tries to end the contract for some reason. I did want to mention the Lewis versus Premium Investment Corp case in South Carolina, because it is sort of the seminal case that sort of started the process of what's a court going to look at when you're talking about a default on installment sale contract like this. So if you want to take a little bit deeper dive, that's a good place to start. Okay, so when you have a contract for deed, installment land contract, bond for title, whatever it's called, are you really buying the property? Is it a sale or is it not a sale? Well, it's something we call usually, depending on what the contract says, it's usually a conditional sale, and that means there's a condition before the sale is completed. And of course, with this type of a contract, the condition is that the payments have to be made. In other words, the seller says, okay, I'm going to perform this act and give you a deed, but it's conditioned on you making all these payments. So you might have to make payments for 10 years before you actually get the deed over to yourself. So it's really technically not a legal transfer of title or sale until that point. But again, the intention of the parties is shown by the terms in that document. That's what controls when a court is looking at these to determine, well, was it a conditional sale or not? Okay, and you might, we talked a little bit at the beginning about mortgages. Is it like a mortgage? No, it really isn't. But there are some things to think about when it comes to how mortgages work versus how installment land contracts work. So if you default in your contract, some of your rights may still include the right to pay it off. So if they have said, okay, you're in default, you haven't made the payment, or you didn't keep the insurance, or whatever it is, and you may say, well, I just want to go ahead and pay it all off, because at that point, it might be that you can qualify for a mortgage, and get that money in another way. Also, you do have the right to have a judge determine what is owed and whether or not you actually have a contract and you can keep the property, or you can keep paying and get that deed either now or down the road when you're supposed to get it. Now, some other things to think about when it comes to this type of contract, which is not really a mortgage. In bankruptcy, if you have a mortgage and you're past due, you owe, let's say, $2,000, it will take that much to catch it up. Well, you can file Chapter 13 bankruptcy, which is where you can kind of make payments for 3 to 5 years and catch up that debt and pay something on your other debts as well. Chapter 13 bankruptcies, and any bankruptcy really has to include everything that you owe. And so with the mortgage, you can just pay that past due amount, keep making your regular monthly payment, and then at some point during the bankruptcy, you paid all of that past due amount and any other amounts that have to be paid in the bankruptcy, and then you're back to square one, making that regular monthly payment of your mortgage and your current, right? Well, with a installment land contract, not the same thing. It's treated as what they call an executory contract in bankruptcy, and that basically means it's still in the process, sort of. It's not fully executed yet. And so with these kind of contracts, you have to be careful if you find yourself in a situation where you need to file bankruptcy, whether it be because of your installment land contract or some other reason. There are many other reasons you might have to file bankruptcy. So keep that in mind, that you're definitely going to need some good advice from a bankruptcy lawyer when it comes to that. The other thing to mention when it comes to mortgage versus installment land contract is eviction in magistrate court. So lots of sellers who use these kind of instruments or these kind of contracts, they want to represent themselves, and they want to do it in magistrate court because that's really the place that you can do that most effectively. And they're going to file it as an eviction, especially if your contract says payments will be forfeited as rent. But you do have the right to what's called an equitable interest in the property, which we'll talk about further in just a moment. But you have an interest in that real property because of your installment land contract. And so magistrate court does not have jurisdiction over that. Anything that involves land, you can notify the magistrate, hey, this is I'm not a tenant. It's not a landlord-tenant relationship. I'm buying this property. So this case involves an interest in real estate. Okay? And so when that notification to the magistrate court happens, which you have to do, then they're going to move the case to the circuit court and not keep it in the magistrate court, because when it comes to interest in real estate, magistrate doesn't have jurisdiction. It has to go up to the circuit court. Now, it can sometimes stay in the magistrate court if you let it. If you don't raise that issue for the magistrate, it might just stay there. So it's up to you to do that. And we've listed here how you can answer that eviction notice by saying there is a question of the title to the land. The only other thing you have to do is to put up a written bond, and then the case is going to be moved to the circuit court to have a trial there. So what do I mean when I say an equitable interest in the property? Okay, when you have this kind of a contract, it can be split into two different interests. Now you have the legal title, and that's the person who actually owns the property and has that deed in their name. But there can also be an equitable interest in the property, and that's what you have under an installment land contract, as long as the contract makes it clear that that's what the intent is, and you can protect that equitable interest. That's an interest that is, really solely yours because you're making these payments, you're living in the property, and you have this expectation of owning the property at the conclusion of the contract. And at that point, you're supposed to have legal title, and that's by the seller giving you that deed. Here's some examples that you need to watch for of wording that might be in a contract that a seller is offering you that would possibly exclude that interest that you have as an equitable interest. So it might say, on default, all amounts paid will be retained as rent. Okay, so if you sign something that says that, you're kind of saying, I don't really have any equitable interest left in this property if I stop paying. So be careful about that, because that may point to some other provisions in the contract that you might need to look at. And here's another one. This agreement will not be construed as passing or having passed ownership, title, or interest in the subject premises, either legal or equitable. If it says that and you sign it, then that's your intent. Your intent is that you're not going to have that equitable interest. So you don't want to sign a contract that says that. And do keep in mind that when it comes to dealing with a dispute on something like this in court, the court is going to presume that you have read what you signed. So you can't come into court and say, well, oh, I didn't see that. That's not what I thought it was. When you sign that document, you're presumed to know what you're signing and to be in agreement with what that document says. And so even though it can be very tiresome to read one of these documents, you really do need to do that. And we always recommend that you get a lawyer to look over it for you and make sure that they can share with you what that document you're signing really means, what it really says, and make sure whether or not that's what you're intending. Remember, intent of the parties really does rule in these cases. Okay, and here's one other thing. What if you as the buyer pass away? Okay, and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to own this house, I'm going to live in it, I'll pass it down to my children, or I'll leave it to my spouse, or whatever. But if you pass away, what happens? Well, sometimes the seller is going to, want you to think that it's all over and they're just going to take the property back and you forfeit the payments of his rent or something like that. But the probate code does define property as anything that may be the subject of ownership. And so if you own that equitable interest that we were talking about, then this property should be listed in your estate. All the kind of the same rules apply when it comes to how land, real property is passed down through your estate. And so in some cases, if all you had was a home that you owned outright, and you had a deed to it, that you have to open an estate for that interest in real property to pass to your heirs, whoever you have designated. That's no doubt about that. But sometimes people don't realize that the same is true for an installment land contract. So don't be fooled by someone saying, "Oh no, that's not a regular deed, so that doesn't go in your estate." Actually, it probably does go in your estate if you've done it right. And your personal representative, which back in the old days they called executor, that person still has the right on your behalf as the personal representative of your estate to perform that land installment contract. So to keep making the payments, to transfer it to your heirs so they can continue to make the payments until there's ownership. But you got to be careful and make sure that there's not something in that contract that when you sign it that somehow prohibits that. Okay, so this is something I think is really important for you to look for as well. So, but your personal representative can continue to perform that contract, and that shouldn't be a problem unless there was something in the contract language that prohibits that or prevents it. Okay, well, that is some just basics about installment land contracts, bond for title, contract for deed, all those other names that I wanted to share with you in this presentation. The main thing is to, if you can, get some legal help when you're going to do something like this. Anytime you're buying property or buying an interest in property, you really do need to reach out and find some legal help from an attorney who can tell you what your rights are, what kind of contract you're entering into, and then if something kind of goes wrong, you need to reach out to an attorney at that time as well. For example, if you get sued for eviction or something of that nature, if you need to file bankruptcy, how does that need to be handled so I can preserve that equitable interest in the property? So hopefully that's been helpful to everyone. Let me just make sure that we don't have any questions. Doesn't look like we do. But you can always feel free, if you're watching the replay, to put a question in the comment section. Obviously, as we always say at the beginning of Level Up Law, we can't really give specific legal advice unless you get accepted as one of our clients, and then we're allowed to give legal advice on a particular matter. But sometimes general questions we can certainly answer, so feel free to put a comment there. Now, another thing we always want you to do is give us ideas of what you'd like a topic to be on Level Up Law. If you've got we've got over 100, maybe 125 episodes of Level Up Law on all different areas of and specific questions that we practice in. And so there's a lot there, but there's a lot more we can do. But we need your help as far as what the subject is. Is there something you'd like us to do a Level Up Law episode? Scan this QR code and fill out that form so that we can do that for you. Give a couple of more seconds for you to do that. And then, of course, we do want to give you all of our connection information. Okay. This is how you can apply for our services. That's by phone or online. So online, of course, you can do it 24/7. But when it comes to the telephone, our intake office is open Monday through Thursday from 9 to 6. They are closed on Friday because they do have that paperwork they got to do. So they're not answering those phones on Friday, but the rest of the week, 9 to 6, they are. So you can't do it online, or you prefer to do it by phone, that's always an option. Again, here's that QR code you can scan to start getting our newsletter if you're not already getting it. And all of our social media handles are here. We've got a lot of good information that comes out on our social media channel. Not only the upcoming episodes of Level Up Law, but lots of other great information, events and clinics we're having around the state, notices about things that you need to know about. For example, the South Carolina foreclosure rescue funds are only taking applications, I think, until April 20th, and you need to know about that. We put that out on our social media. So those are important things. This is one example of important things that we want the public to know about, whether you're a client of ours or not. So that really concludes today's presentation about installment land contracts, but I do want to make sure that you remember that we will have the replay recording of this on our YouTube channel, so you can look at it again there, or if you're on the replay right now, thanks for being here. And go ahead and give us a thumbs up on this video and any others that you have found helpful. And also, if you think it might be helpful to someone else that you know, share it out so it reaches as many people as possible. That's really important to us. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that now as well, and sign up for those notifications so you'll always know when we have posted a new episode of Level Up Law. One quick thing that we always like to let you know is what is coming up on next week's episode of Level Up Law, and we're really excited. It is Fair Housing Month, and our litigation director, Mark Fessler, is going to be talking to the Greenville County Human Relations Commission about fair housing complaints and how that system works. There's a whole process. There's ways that housing counselors at places like the Human Relations Commission can help you through that process and assist you with those complaints and other matters as well. So I think that'll be a terrific thing for people to know about the ins and outs of how that complaint process works. And what better time to do it than Fair Housing Month, which is this month of April. So I think that's all we have for today. Be sure and tune in next week for that episode. And thanks to you for joining us today on Level Up Law. That concludes today's presentation. Thanks, everybody.